It's early May in Memphis. I'm here at Elmwood, as we have been for the first season here, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic. It's a thing. It's been a problem for a little bit of a while, and it's probably going to be a problem for a good long time. And the pandemic is really sort of the source of the story behind this episode of Drinking with Dead People, as we take a look at a pandemic that occurred, well, over several years here in this fair city, with one of them being really bad. It nearly wiped out this city completely. We'll tell you about it as we take a look at the epidemic and the pandemic that was the yellow fever.
Every stone marks a story. Interesting stories, people like you and I. History that should be recounted. Here we toast those you may or may not know who have gone on before us and left behind their tales to be told. Here we'll be drinking with dead people.
It all started in 1873 in this area when just after the Civil War, there was a problem. People were starting to get pretty sick. What was it? What caused these people to suddenly have a fever, their skin turning yellow, projectile vomiting, their eyes kind of bleeding? It was an awful disease. It was devastating, to be putting it bluntly. By 1878, it had gotten so bad here in Memphis that the city lost its charter. Nashville became the taxing authority for Memphis. That's like 3 hours away in modern time. It's crazy to think about it. But at one point there were some 20,000 people that lived in this area, and the population had been reduced by half. Bodies were piled up all over the place over here in the midst of the pandemic, and they just didn't know what to do. So mass graves were dug here in an area known as No Man's Land. There were several of them in and around the cemetery here at Elmwood, and these bodies would be buried, sometimes 40, 50 a day. It became a bit of a problem because there's a bell up by the gate. And tradition holds that when someone is buried here, they ring that bell. They had people here that were ringing that bell for 24 hours straight to account for the dead from across those 3 years. It was a really, really bad situation. But it was solved. Like any other pandemic, there is always a conclusion to it. And the yellow fever pandemic was certainly one to be considered, if it wasn't for the help of one Walter Reed. Walter Reed was a Northern soldier in the Civil War. He had a fascination for medicine, and he wanted to do more in his part to benefit humanity, as most people who study medicine and physicians that want to do. They want to save lives. They want to improve the living conditions of others. And it was no different here. And at the breakout of the 1873 version of the yellow fever, panic began to ensue. And he became eminently fascinated with what was going on. For many years, people thought that yellow fever was one of those things that you could just catch if you happened to be around it. Well, and people were dying, and there would be people wrapped in their version of face masks and, well, the standard pandemic gear that we've all become so used to wearing over the past several months in these parts in today's day and age. And as it turned out, that wasn't the case at all. It was transmitted by a mosquito. How would that be? How would that be learned? Well, it was quite simple, really. Once the idea was brought forth that mosquitoes could carry this disease, and that, in fact, yellow fever was a blood-borne virus, then the testing became a little more elaborate and very, very dangerous. Walter wound up going down to Cuba, where they'd had several outbreaks of the disease. Plus, it allowed them to work almost year-round because of the constant supply of mosquitoes and, well, frankly, the constant supply of yellow fever. It became an interesting testing mode when they'd set up 2 tents. One had a body that had died of yellow fever, and in there they stuck a bunch of mosquitoes. Next to it was another tent, this one with just mosquitoes that had not been, as far as they knew, exposed to yellow fever. Walter Reed's doctors and associates that began to work with him decided that they would use themselves as test subjects by putting themselves in the tent with the body that had the yellow fever and allowed those mosquitoes to attack them. As you can imagine, those doctors did get sick. Some of them even died. But it proved the point that yellow fever was, in fact, a blood-borne disease spread primarily by mosquitoes. This ultimately led to a vaccine which exists to this day, still a viable disease. It's never been truly eradicated, but it's certainly been under control. In the mid to late 1870s, it wasn't going to be the case. So how did it get to Memphis? Well, theories are abound, and one of which is that it came up the river. That's right, from New Orleans. There was a lot of traffic on the Mississippi River as people were coming back and forth, and it was the end of the war and Reconstruction was under phase. Everything was happening. Ultimately, it came here from tropical environments and subtropical environments. One place where it still ravages to this day is in the center of Africa. Going back to another very dark time in our history, during the slave trade, when those ships would bring those slaves back and forth, well, primarily one way, across the Atlantic, those people were strapped on board these horribly dingy boats, some dying along the way, their bodies being thrown overboard as they came. Pools of water would form on the decks of the boat, and mosquitoes that had lived primarily there in Africa had hitched a ride across the Atlantic. Ultimately, following the slave trade into New Orleans and up through Memphis, well, that's where the virus became more of a viable thing. The mosquito that's primarily responsible for it is one known as the Aedes aegypti. It's still a popular mosquito around here. In fact, so popular that trying to eradicate the thing is nearly impossible. Vector control is sort of an issue here. No standing water, none of that sort of thing can exist because these mosquitoes are known to carry all sorts of blood-borne disease, and it becomes a scary thought to think about it. More recently, West Nile virus was one such blood-borne disease carried by mosquito that came through this area, as did Zika. But none nearly as devastating as yellow fever. With the amount of death and destruction that this disease had ravaged upon people, it was amazing the city even survived at all. In fact, it almost didn't. People fled this city. They moved north. They went out of here to get away from what they thought was just an incredibly dangerous situation. But there were those that stayed. And they came to help those that were afflicted, that were dying. As it turns out, a very odd thing was happening. Black folks tend not to be affected by yellow fever. And a lot of those folks stayed behind to help those that were getting sick, which were a lot of white people. However you want to dice it up, it was still a tragic situation. With so many deaths and so many bodies piling up here at Elmwood Cemetery, it was hard to get the job done to bury the dead. Mass graves were buried in different parts of this cemetery to account for all the bodies. And so there was, not too terribly long ago, a marker established referring to the area as no man's land. The piles of bodies that had been thoroughly and properly buried, forever to be remembered as victims of the yellow fever. Pandemics come and go. That's just a fact. We're in one now, at least as of depending on when you're watching this. In May of 2020 is where our production date is. There'll be others, and hopefully we'll be prudent about such matters. Certainly medicine has come a very, very long way since the 1878 final major outbreak of yellow fever in this area. Since then, we've had the Spanish flu. We've managed to get through that. That was a little over 100 years ago. And now COVID-19, which has become a political, weird, sort of fun fight that seems to be happening with, thankfully, not as much fatalities as yellow fever and some of the others like Spanish flu. So what could be said about all of this? Well, like I mentioned, they all kind of come to an end at some point. And when they do, we learn something more about the way people have lived and died and what happens when people get sick on a huge, huge level. As for those in no man's land that are scattered throughout this wonderful cemetery, it's about time we drank for you. And tune in next time and join us for for another time when we wander these wonderful headstones and be drinking with dead people. If you'd like to learn more about the yellow fever and its impact on the city of Memphis and basically the killing of 5,100 people and their bodies in the mass graves that are here at Elmwood, I recommend a great book on the subject written by Molly Caldwell Crosby. It's called An American Plague. Get it, read it, you'll learn a fantastic story, and you'll learn something new.